Maybe you could go apologize to her?
You really think she wants to forgive the guy that beat her half to death with a baseball bat?
You did pay TSG to repair her, and then let her off on her own.
You think I'm an abusive boyfriend?
Yes?
Ugh.
I need to clear my head.
Good evening, fine sir. May I interest you in a game of chess?
Not interested. Don't even know how to play chess.
I must say, it will take your mind off of the things which bother you.
Yeah, somehow I doubt that.
I promise it's not that different from that SRPG you've been playing lately.
Why don't we get started with you telling me who the hell you are? Oh, for fuck's sake.
My name is Melancholia, and I wish to play a game of chess with a Mr. Nihilistic Nerd.
I already told you, I don't know how to play chess. Also, chess is nothing like an SRPG, you pasty-faced retard.
Young man, I am no longer being cordial. We will play chess whether you like it or not.
No, we're not, you stupid vet.
Well, I guess I'm dead. At least I don't have to play with... So are you gonna teach me how to play chess?
I'll teach as we go. In fact, as a show of good faith, I will let you first.
What does that do?
That, young man, is a pawn. Pawns can move forward one space and capture enemy pieces one square diagonally.
Okay. Bro, what the fuck? You said a pawn can move forward one space.
Oops, it appears I forgot to tell you that pawns can move forward 2 spaces from their starting position.
Symphony of War, the Nephilim Saga, is a tactical turn-based RPG that released in June 10th, 2022. It was the first game developed by Dancing Dragon Studios, meaning once again we are continuing the trend of reviewing a studio's first game. I've never reviewed such a mechanically in-depth game like Symphony of War, so there's going to be plenty of smaller details I will be skimming over. Things like the story. Speaking of story, the game starts with a questionnaire that will alter the player character stats. This ultimately will not matter unless you're a min-maxer, which would honestly make this game perfect for you. I, on the other hand, prefer to actually enjoy the games I play, so I'm not gonna fret over stuff like this. Next, the player chooses whether to have balls or boobs. Since I'm a gamer, and I'm obligated to hate women, I chose the male character. The intro gives a rundown of the current events and sets the narrative in motion. It's really just some typical feudalism. Some guy got mad at the politicians for ruining his country and formed a rebellion. After a quick tutorial, the player and their best friend set off to quell said rebellion. Things go as planned, until they don't when a bureaucrat double-crosses the two, leading to the both of them being separated and imprisoned. After being casually tortured, a handsome man named Stefan frees the main character. During this dungeon escape, they meet up with the big lady Diana, who, believe it or not, will get even bigger. Oh my god, step on me. After escaping the dungeon, the player is taken to the Church of Donari headquarters. This is where they learn that they are one of the Nephilim, the saviors of the world. It should be clear that the game is a pretty run-of-the-mill good versus evil story with some emphasis on theological themes. Honestly, I think I'm kind of outgrowing this type of narrative. The whole killing gods stuff kind of gets old. It's really unfortunate that most RPGs tend to follow this trope, but really that's just a me thing. That said, even if this was my preferred way of telling a story, it's still a pretty average story. In that regard, the characters within Nephilim Saga are also somewhat lacking characterization, especially when you compare it to other JRPGs. That said, there were a few notable characters, like Lysander, who was my favorite character. He joins early game after betraying the Imperium. He comes fully kitted out with a bunch of gun guys, and he heals all his units when he activates. He's actually really decent. Another notable character is Ruskaja, and that's because he's the only furry in the entirety of the game. Also, he's the only main character that you have the option to purchase. He's a pretty decent light infantry, especially at night when he can ambush during every attack. There's also Abigail, who boosts the growth rate of dragons in her party. This makes her easily the best character for building up dragon riders. It's also part of her character within the story, I guess. SRPGs and TRPGs tend to focus more on the gameplay over a compelling narrative and deep characters. Symphony of War is not an exception in this case. To combat that, a game has to rely on having unique gameplay, and that's where this game finds its biggest success. Symphony of War has one incredibly unique aspect that differentiates itself from most of its contemporaries: the squad building system. Unlike most SRPGs, where a single unit is a single character, Symphony of War has players create a squad of up to 9 individual units. And when I say individual units, I mean individual units. Each unit has varying stats, growth rates, elements, and traits that will determine their capabilities within battle. I'm not going to get too in-depth with the stats and shit. The only stat that I really want to mention is the leadership stat. This is what determines how many units you can have in your squad. I will also say that elements do affect growth rates of units. For instance, the earth element is excellent for creating tank units as it boosts defense. Fire is good for fighters, and water is great for mages. Moving on, traits either naturally exist on a unit or can be learned from items. These are basically perks. Examples range from Arcane Barrier, which adds a shield to the unit based on half of its magic stat, Scavenger, which enables money pickups from killing enemies, and Desert Warrior, which makes the unit fight better on desert tiles. There are also leader traits. As long as this trait is on the squad leader, this ability affects the entirety of the squad. An example would be Garrison. This increases the defense bonus of terrain tiles. Finally, the movement type of a squad can more often than not be determined by whatever unit type is most present within said squad. A simple example is, say the player has 3 Cavaliers and 2 Medics. That squad's movement type is going to be cavalry, which not only gives it 7 spaces to move, it enables movement after an attack. Yeah, that's right, they actually made cavalry good in this game. Creating a bunch of powerhouse units is cool and all, but the players will have to take into consideration squad cohesion. A group of mages can output a fuck ton of damage, but if they so much as get sneezed on, they'll eat shit faster than a pedophile in a prison yard. One could make a dedicated mage death squad and only use it if it guarantees a kill and keep it protected at all times, which is fucking lame. Actually, that won't even work because of how combat flows, but we'll get into that later. Or they could put a bunch of tank units in the front line to absorb most of the incoming damage. A single squad should seldom have less than 3 unit types. A tank squad could benefit from a bunch of armored guys just taking damage, but adding a couple healers in the backline can create a squad that can come out of a weaker attack with more health than it had going in. In my case, I created a counter-tank cavalry squad running multiple cavalries, which are mounted paladins, to both heal and counter the enemy assaults, as well as a bunch of damage dealers in the back line. For Stefan, I found myself running a bunch of assassins and paladins. When launching an attack, assassins will target the back lines first. This is great for eliminating enemy healers, mages, and archers, since they won't need to break through the armored front line. There are so many different ways to build a squad in this game, it's actually mind-melting. There are 48 classes amongst 3 tiers in this game. It should be noted that dragons get 4 tiers because they're just that cool. Very few of these classes are just a stat upgrade from a previous tier. A spearman is an upgrade from a tier 1 fighter. They basically become a pretty decent anti-cavalry unit. They can also upgrade into hussar, which is a mounted variation of the spearman that can also gain evasion bonuses on specific terrain. Fun fact, the scout can also upgrade into this class as well. Many classes share potential upgrade paths like this. Not only can the spearman upgrade into a hussar, it can also become a sentinel, one of the tankiest classes in the game, a centurion, which can pierce through enemy lines, or a samurai, which wields both a bow and a spear. Players don't even need to commit a unit to a single class. They can change them at any time. I could honestly make an hour-long video just talking about how in-depth the squad building system is in this game. There are just that many intricacies, but I don't have time to get into that here. Alright, well now that I've gone over the units that we'll be using to conquer the world, let's talk about the actual battles in Symphony of War. The Symphony of War is divided into chapters. A chapter usually consists of a cutscene and a combat scenario. The battles take place on square tiled maps of varying sizes. Players deploy their units of choice on the battlefield and then take turns against the computer attempting to accomplish an objective. The typical SRPG conventions are here, such as terrain defense bonuses, capturable side objectives, chests, and resource points. It's not very unique in that regard. Strategic positioning will definitely help win the day, with certain types of units being able to boost their attacks depending on positioning. One of the more notable strategies is light infantry ambush. This can be done by having light infantry start in a tile that provides cover, then move to attack the enemy whilst still in a tile that provides cover. This allows them to get 2 simultaneous attacks on the enemy squad and removes one of their counters. Speaking of combat engagement, in very simple terms, a typical engagement has both squads take 2 actions. Most melee units will attack twice, mages take 1 action to start casting and a second to attack, and until late game tech, firearms squads will only fire once per engagement. This means both parties get to attack twice during an engagement. Of course, there are always exceptions. The game will open up even more strategic avenues down the line, with things like tech upgrades, specifically aggressive and cautious attacks. These give both buffs and debuffs when players initiate an attack on an enemy. They also last until the player's next turn. Players can also force surrender, which, if successful, boosts the attacking squad's leadership. It also gives extra gold and faction points. I'll talk more about the faction levels and tech tree later. About halfway through the game, the player unlocks powers. These are non-squad specific abilities that can be activated at any time on the player's turn, provided they're not on cooldown. These really help when it comes to completing objectives or just making combat easier. A bunch of enemies grouped up, summon a meteor storm. Can't cross a lake to protect an ally? Teleport across it. These are super fun to use and add yet another layer to combat. Most of the time, the player's goal is to seize a specific point. This is normally done by moving a unit onto said point and seizing it. All chapters have at least 1 side objective. These are usually something like finish the map in a set amount of turns or kill a specific squad. Besides that, there are some really unique missions that don't follow the traditional style. One of the more memorable chapters was Chapter 15. In this chapter, players are tasked with escorting children off basically Epstein Island. To do this, the player must eliminate several Minecraft YouTubers whilst the children flee across a bridge. A few turns into the chapter, the Symphony of War equivalent of the Antichrist appears and then starts to chase the children. I'm assuming he'll one-shot the player squads since players are actually able to play as the bad guys in the previous chapter, and he was outright unstoppable. Once the kids are over the bridge, you can command a unit to cut down the bridge and complete the chapter.
And with that, I shall turn my pawn into a queen.
You know, I never agreed to play this stupid game with you.
Oh, you did. From the moment you started to wallow in self-pity for abusing that robot. What a horrible predicament you find yourself in.
How do you know so much about me?
I am a being of pure emotion. Your emotional immaturity is interesting to me.
Emotional maturity?
Hide it all you want, young man. It doesn't change a thing. At least now, instead of rotting in bed all day, you can serve a purpose. After I beat you in this game of chess, I will slowly drain your life force for 1,000 years until you're nothing but a husk.
So you mean we've been playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Shadow Realm Duel this whole time, but instead of playing Yu-Gi-Oh! We're playing some gay-ass chess?
It wasn't part of the budget.
Between chapters, players will have the opportunity to upgrade their tech with the faction points they've earned. As I mentioned before, this will grant things like extra tactics. It also grants stuff like more options in shops, new units, as well as better resource management. A good player could probably unlock the full tech tree by chapter 20, but I'm not a good player. I unlocked it at 25. One of the coolest upgrades is the Dragon Rider class. These will be your only flying units. However, unlike most SRPGs I've played, that being Shining Force and Fire Emblem, these flying units don't suck. Of course, there are plenty more upgrades you can get. Between chapters, the player can also use the shop to buy new units, artifacts, and trade resources. Artifacts grant passive stat upgrades or even new abilities to a squad. Picking these up is a pretty good idea. Trading resources is an interesting mechanic. Many of the higher tier classes require 1 or 2 resources to upgrade to said unit. There are also 2 tiers of resources which can be traded 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 within their tier. The resources are also not consumable, so if the player ends up changing classes down the line, the resources that were used are placed back into the player's inventory. When players start getting access to higher tier classes, they might not have enough of a specific resource. This is where the trading comes in. Players can also trade arena tokens here, but they're not a 1-to-1 trade. Speaking of arena tokens, these are going to be insanely useful when it comes to leveling up your weaker units. There are 4 arena levels, each with an increasing difficulty and each with an increasing reward. Last and certainly least is the support menu. Every SRPG since the early 2000s is legally obligated to have some sort of relationship mechanic in it, no matter how shoehorned in it is. Symphony of War is no different here. I'm not a fan of this kind of stuff, and Symphony of War doesn't do it any better, but hey, at least it's fairly linear, and it gives players faction points for having conversations and forming bonds. I will admit that some of the dialogue is pretty funny, but this is still one of the weaker points of the game. Most SRPGs are menu heavy by default, however, it's the execution that determines whether this is a problem or not. While I myself didn't have too much of an issue navigating the menus, I could see it becoming tedious, especially when editing squads. The menus also don't look particularly pretty either, but that's just a matter of personal taste. Moving on to the sprite graphics, the battle sprites are actually really good looking, their animations are flashy, cool, and they just look really neat. The map sprites also are pretty good. However, I do have one issue with the graphics, and that's the clash between the semi-realistic character portraits and the cutesy anime sprite work. They really don't mesh too well. That's not to say the portrait designs are bad. I would have just personally gone with a different style. Maybe something more anime-esque or an emphasis on pixel art. If you haven't noticed, this game was actually completely built in RPGMaker VX Ace, and it definitely uses assets from that. Certain icons and animations. It's not great, but at the same time, this is a 3-man dev team, so I can't fault them too much. The RPGMaker assets also bleeds over into the sound design. Again, it's really only noticeable if you have the program or you've played other RPGMaker games. Be that as it may, the gameplay is so drastically unique compared to all the other RPGMaker swill on Steam, this shouldn't even be considered a problem. The music is also somewhat of a weak spot for me. Again, it's not bad, but it's not very memorable either. The only song that really stuck out to me was this one, which I think is only the case because most other songs sound similar. Once again, they're not bad, but they all sound pretty generic. Symphony of War: The Nephilim Saga was one of the most unique SRPGs I've played in recent memory. Despite its shortcomings, it is still an incredibly solid game with 30 chapters, plus 5 optional side chapters, and 4 difficulties. I played on Captain, which was the game's intended experience. For $20, I think I got my money's worth here. There's also a DLC that I didn't cover during this review. It adds a new game plus, 8 optional chapters, and a few new units. There's a freaking war cat in it, and it looks cool as fuck, but alas, I haven't played it, so I can't say much there. The DLC is $10. I'll probably pick it up down the road when I got money and time to spare. It's been stated by the devs that Symphony of War is the first in a series, and it appears they're already working on a sequel, which is set 120 years after the events of this one. After playing this first game, I can say I'm pretty invested and will definitely check out the sequel. As always, if you're interested in the game, I'll have a link to the Steam page in the description below.
It's been blatantly obvious that you've been holding back information from me this whole time in an effort to diminish my already low chances of winning this stupid game. However, what you don't know is that I have been holding back information from you.
What is this, the part where you reveal you're a chess master?
Oh, no, that's gay. It's the part where I reveal
I cheat.
That's not cheating. That's just being a...
What, you're already done soul searching?
Yeah, but I think it's time for a change of pace.